My name is Nina Lockwood and I'm the founder and director of Intuitive Talent Solutions. We're a boutique search agency providing interim management and executive search services to our clients in the UK transport sector. We work with owning groups, with train operating companies, with regional bus companies, as well as supporting organisations to the sector, such as the Rail Delivery Group, rail partners, and also clients in the supply chain. Today's webinar is the third in the series, and we have broken all previous records with the number of folk registered today. So a massive thank you to everybody who is showing up this afternoon. We really do appreciate your support. Thank you. We've been overwhelmed by the positive feedback that we've received from the previous two sessions, and I'm 100% confident that today will provide food for thought and inspiration. We also host the Intuitive Insights podcast series, where I'm lucky enough to be joined by members of the transport family who share their career stories and their own views on the current state of play in the industry. You can find all episodes of our podcast on our website, intuitiverecruitment.com, and you will also find recordings of our two previous ED&I webinars there too, which featured Lorraine Martins, ex of Network Rail, now at Nichols Group, Sharon Amesu, who is an amazing leadership consultant focusing specifically on encouraging more Black professional women into the industry. Alex Hind, who is MD of Scotland's Railway, and DDS Dobson-Smith, who is an author and ED&I expert. So we've had amazing guests so far, and we've got another two cracking guests for you today. Today's conversation will focus on allyship. Inclusive employers define an ally as someone who is not a member of a marginalised group, but wants to support and take action to help others in that group. Allyship in the workplace is crucial for equality and inclusion. Today's discussion will focus very much on practicing allyship rather than just being an ally. There's an important differentiation there. The key is in the doing rather than just the being. I'm over the moon to be joined for this important conversation by two individuals who bring a wealth of knowledge to this subject. Anit Chandarana, Lead Director of the Great British Railway Transition Team, who is heading up one of the most ambitious changes to our railway in a generation and is a highly respected industry leader. Alongside Anit's role at the Great British Railway Transition Team, it's a mouthful, easy for me to say, he is also a non-executive director for East London NHS Foundation Trust and a former chair of two Network Rail trustee boards. Having had the absolute pleasure of Anit joining me on the Intuitive Insights podcast, I can tell you that he is a super interesting individual. He's passionate about making a real difference. And he's very open. I found his conversation to be one of the most open and vulnerable conversations that I've had. He also understands firsthand how important strong allyship is in practice, and he'll be sharing some of his own personal insights with us today. Gareth Hind describes himself as a dad, a husband, a son, a friend, a Disney fanatic and a keen golfer, and is the head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at First Bus. Gareth joined the transport industry just over 6 months ago from a career in food retail, and so he's gone from feeding the nation to moving the nation. He is award-winning in cultural transformation and has a wealth of experience in effective allyship. I'm also completely amazed by the amount of change that he's already brought into play at First Bus, bearing in mind he only joined them a short time ago. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more detail around how he's achieved that today. So the running order for today, we will hear Anit's story first, and then Gareth will share some of the magic he's been creating at First Bus before a 10-minute comfort break. And when we come back, there'll be a discussion around allyship and what it means in practice. It's really important to me that these webinars give you something which you can take back to the workplace, something tangible in relation to making change happen so that we can continue to kind of keep this education process going, which turns into real action. There'll be a discussion around allyship and what it means in practice, leading into a Q&A where I would encourage you to post any questions that you have in the chat, and we will do our best to come to as many of these as possible in the time that we have available. A quick shout out to our Caroline, who will be present in the chat room throughout the webinar, and will be making sure that your questions are passed on to me, as I'm incapable of doing more than one thing at a time. So Caroline's in charge of questions. And we'll also, just a kind of point of interest, we are recording the whole session and it will appear on our website over the next few days. So if you have any colleagues that you think would be interested in this, then you can feel free to signpost them. So without further ado, let's get cracking. I'm going to introduce and welcome Anit Chandarana to today's webinar.
Hi, Nina. Thank you for the brilliant introduction. If you could tell, I'm blushing, but
I can, just about. It's an absolute joy and a pleasure to welcome you to the webinar, Anit. Our first conversation is quite a few months ago now, and I feel like we've been getting to know each other over that time, and each and every conversation that we have had lifts my spirits, inspires me and educates me. So there's no pressure there. I've not set the bar that high, but I'm going to hand over to you to share your experiences, your insights, your thoughts in relation to what strong allyship means to you.
Thanks, Nina. Maybe today's going to be the day I reset the bar back down at the low level so that I can climb it up again. But you can tell me that at the end. And so thinking about allyship, and I'm not going to come at this from a theoretical perspective or a textbook perspective. I'm going to come at it from my personal experiences of allyship, which means that this is my story, and it means this is what was true for me, but may not be true for others and for everyone else. So whilst there will be elements of learning to take from, what I'm not giving anyone is the blueprint for allyship, because I'm not sure such a thing exists. And hopefully when we get towards the end of today's webinar, we'll understand better why I think that. I think the first thing to say is I can, with my hand on my heart, say without allyship, I probably wouldn't be where I am today. And I say that with a slightly heavy heart, because we still have the need for that. But mostly I say that with joy in my heart, because it means that people did think it was important enough to play that role. And if they did for me, I'm really confident that there'll be people out there doing similar for others. And of course, what I'm hoping is there's people on this call who will see their role as an ally, as well as people who are seeking allies. And I think the other thing to kind of bring out in that big way is, as well as my needing allyship from others, I can also be an ally to others people in the areas that perhaps are not the one that I experience in my day-to-day life. And so it's not an exclusive club, and we mustn't feel like, because some of us who are from those minority groups, that we don't have a role to play in allyship for others. So to start with, I thought maybe a couple of examples of where I've really seen allyship at work in my lifetime, and I'm going to stretch a bit beyond my working life, because allyship can be exhibited in any number of walks of life. And as ever, Nina, you got me thinking a bit harder about this than I had been previously when you and I spoke last. And I think my first kind of living memory of allyship comes from kind of the neighbourhood I lived in when we were growing up. So I grew up in a part of southeast London that was not particularly culturally diverse. We were the only family of colour in our area. I almost sound like I should be in a comedy programme or something at that stage. And what I remember is we moved from a place called Bromley to a place called Mottingham in the early 80s. And we that part of London was it actually had some pretty decent problems around race relations and so on. And I remember one time a really difficult situation where the house we lived on was on a main road, and somebody threw a brick through our front door, and it was and around it was a message which was clearly a difficult message for us to read about how we weren't welcome in that area. And what I remember is the way our close neighbours really rallied around us. Really, despite that really unwelcoming moment, really made us feel welcome. And perhaps were it not for that, we'd have felt like we'd have had to have moved, which would have meant that those who were filled with hate would have won.
Yes.
And for me, that really describes the power of allyship, because it can be a lonely place to be in that world of difference, to be the person that's different there. And then beyond that, it provides determination, and it provides rationalization for why we would feel determined not to be beaten by that situation. And as I kind of take that forward into my school life, I really, and this next instance didn't come from a moment of hate at all. It came from a moment of somebody genuinely not understanding that there is difference. And some of you might know that last week was a really important cultural event for people of the Hindu religion. It was Diwali last week. And thinking about today reminded me of something that happened at school. So Diwali, for those of you who don't know about it, is the most significant event in the Hindu calendar. It is celebrated by Hindus in much the same way as Christmas is celebrated by Christians. Indeed, it's celebrated by as much as a cultural festival as much as a religious festival. And when I was growing up in school, my parents were really keen to keep that tradition going in our family. So every year when that came around, we would not go to school, all done properly with school permission. And one of my actually quite close friends said, "Well, it's not very fair, is it? This is a school day. You get Christmas off as well. Why would you get today off?" Genuine curiosity. And my teacher overheard this, and she said, "Well, that's all right then. We'll cancel Christmas holidays, shall we?"
Right.
And and she did it in a way that caught the mood of the moment. It wasn't a difficult moment, and she did it in a way that was quite humorous, but still got her point across. And in that moment, that individual went, "Oh yeah, that would be stupid, wouldn't it? Oh, okay, off you go."
Yeah.
And bred kind of understanding in a really, really nice way. So maybe a couple of examples of outside work, which I picked deliberately because it's quite tempting when we are having these conversations to think about allyship within the defined world of work. And in doing that, we perhaps don't think of the importance of that it goes beyond the world of work, and we don't do it from the perspective of this is about fairness and natural justice as opposed to making just people feel comfortable at work. Of course, we want to do that, but it's that bigger aim. So if I then kind of collectively think about some examples at work, what have typified some of those examples? And actually, some of the people who've been allies got in touch with me again after our podcast to reminisce and so on. And I think there's different things I pick out from that. First of all, when I think about the people that have been allies, I can think about people who've been in senior positions. I can think of people who've been peers that I work close with, and I can think of people who were potentially team members of mine. I say that because it's quite tempting to think of allies as something that senior people do.
Yeah.
But actually, I'll welcome allyship from anyone that's prepared to give it to me.
Yeah.
And what did those conversations feel like? And this is about personal experiences rather than kind of open discussions that people might have in a room. So some of those discussions have been about personal encouragement. Actually, don't let this be a barrier to your success. Don't let people win, and giving me encouragement to take the next challenge, not to be beaten by the next challenge. Other times, people have stepped in to defend me, when they've seen bad behaviours, when they've seen people doing the wrong thing, or indeed when they've seen kind of unintended outcomes from conversations. And then finally, they've challenged me. They've challenged me on what I think about my role in the organisation. So one particular example of allyship is when somebody said to me, after I'd become relatively senior in the organisation I was, is, actually, do you think you do enough as a role model of somebody of colour to support others? And showing your success as something that others can aspire to. And again, perhaps a slightly different take on what people might imagine allyship is. So I hope that's kind of illustrated some real examples and some tangible acts of allyship that I have personally experienced and can help others think about that.
Very much so. Yeah, very much so. I think I have a couple of questions. Is that all right?
Yeah.
That feeling of having a brick put through the front door with a message on it. How did your parents respond to that? How did you as a family respond to that before you realised that your closest neighbours were going to be there to support? How did that feel in the moment when that happened?
Yeah, so I should give a bit more context, because in order to answer that question, we need to understand that. So this happened within 2 days of us moving into our new house, where actually we hadn't, up until that point, really even met any of our neighbours. We'd kind of nodded heads in that quite reserved way that people do when you first moved in. We'd not got to the stage of kind of knocking on a door and introducing ourselves or any of that. I guess there were quite surprising aspects from my parents was one of pragmatism. Now, you could see that as something quite positive, but that pragmatism came from this is what you come to expect, which was a really sad aspect. But the other thing that was brilliant was these neighbours that we'd not even met yet were there within minutes.
Okay.
And what that then really created was actually, we don't need to be pragmatic about this, because we don't have to accept it. They were in a position of, well, we'll just have to get a stronger front door, or we can't have a front door with glass in it now. We're going to have a front door with a little bit of glass. And the speed with which the unacceptability of that was acknowledged by neighbours who, offered to guard the front door until it was mended and all that kind of stuff, was amazing.
Right. It's a brilliant example of what people can do when the opportunity strikes, I guess, because there will be, and I'm sure we can all think of situations where people will just kind of turn away and pretend that didn't happen, or would actually think about their own situation, like, oh my word, we're living next to this family and all of this is going to keep happening now they've moved in, kind of comment. but you got the opposite of that, which has made a really significant difference, didn't it?
No, correct. And I think the other aspect of that, and you can really apply this to allyship in general, which is the difference between wanting to understand why what was happening to us and just at the same time recognizing it wasn't acceptable versus kind of pretending to just to imagine that they could understand for themselves without that conversation what it felt like to be in that situation. And some of the things that allyship I think is really pivotal on is we hear kind of terms which aren't put in the nicest ways, but if you've not stood in the shoes of somebody going through that, it's almost impossible to understand what it can feel like. And so much of allyship comes from that understanding of what lived experience can really be like before you can kind of begin to encourage or challenge people is really important. So when allyship is done well, it comes with that strong sense of, I want to understand your situation so I can help you better, as opposed to just diving into sorting the problem out, because actually just sorting the problem out often can work against the allyship perspective.
Yeah, that understanding is so important, isn't it? But I also think it's where one of the blockages appears, because in order to understand, then we have to ask questions, and sometimes it can feel that those questions might be intrusive or too personal, or kind of wanting to, in order to understand, we need to have a conversation, and that conversation might be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But we've got to do it anyway. We've got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. But I think personally, that's one of the blockages where we need to understand better, but there's a kind of, we're holding back from asking the questions because they might not be the right questions.
I think that's really right. And I think if I think of it from the receiving end, trying to figure out how we can create an environment where that allyship is expected as opposed to unexpected is a really important thing to think about, because and I've seen something in the chat which refers to this. If I think back to that situation with the neighbours, the reason it was a surprise was because it wasn't what the reaction we expected from our neighbours. The first time round, the thing that gave us strength was that the second time round, if it were to happen again, we knew that we would expect that reaction. And can you imagine if you are, and you probably can, if you're in an organisation where where life could be unfair at times, and believing that organisation or individuals in that organisation aren't going to be there to support through that difficult times. And the truth is, Nina, is that a lot of our industry, that is exactly how people in minority groups feel. Which is why allyship is really important. And the other aspect of it, the reason it's important, is because it begins to show that this isn't just a struggle for people of minority groups, that actually people from wider environments understand the unjustness and the unfairness of it, and then they're not going to be prepared to stand there and see that happen.
It's interesting. There's another question in the chat from Adam Stevens around leadership, and how does the leadership of, I guess, an industry as well as an organisation build that kind of culture, and I think that's something that we will come on to and discuss in more detail after the break, and in terms of just debating what are the key components of creating a culture where strong allyship does exist, and not only does it exist but it thrives, because we know it's the right thing to do.
No,
And
correct.
therefore it's the way we do things around here.
Exactly. And that kind of brings me on to the second part of what I was going to cover, which is what do I think, what in my experience, what has made good allies? As I say, this is my views, not the textbook answer,
Yeah.
and therefore reflects the opinion of one person rather than somebody who's not particularly academic either. So, so some words that I'll walk through. You can't be an ally in secret. You have to be vocal. You've got to be proud, and you've got to voice that allyship, because the point of allyship is it's not just about individual private conversations you have, either just with yourself or with others. Without that vocalization of it, it's not going to change. You've got to be prepared to challenge. You can't, if you see something that isn't on, so you can't profess to be an ally if you are not prepared to actually step in and say and challenge people who don't deliver against the right values. Of course, I want everyone to be supportive of this, but if you want to call yourself an ally, which is beyond just being supportive, you've got to be prepared to get in there and challenge the status quo. There's also an element then of, if it's about individual allyship, so if you're supporting an individual, it has to be that individual conversation, and it goes back to that understanding of the individual circumstances, and it can't be, there isn't a generic answer to allyship. There is overall allyship, but if it's an individual thing, then it's about understanding. And I've seen some in the stream, some phrases around empathy and really important characteristic. And linked to that, be prepared to hear really what it feels like to be in the shoes in that world. Some of you might have seen a blog that I did when George Floyd's murder occurred, because that really was a moment for me to step back and think about how was my life different to those of my peers around me. And some of you might know a chap called Tim Shoveler, who's at Rail now, and he won't mind me saying this, but he said that whilst he kind of anticipated that the things I'd said happened to people, it wasn't until I had said it happened to me, and then he related it to somebody he knew, that it really came home to him about some of the advantages that he had that just were not real in the life of somebody else in the world. So really understanding that. And one of the things we've been working quite a lot on is reciprocal mentorship, and that might be something we cover later on. And part of my reciprocal mentorship was I've done 2 rounds of that. One with somebody who had mental health and well-being issues and was prepared to talk to me about that, and somebody else who was profoundly deaf and what that meant in their world of work. And I can tell you, I absolutely did not understand their world. I might have thought I did until I had those conversations. And how I thought I could help them as an ally was entirely different after I'd talked to them compared to before I'd talked to them. Really be prepared to role model your allyship, and it's such a powerful instinct to see, we particularly for leaders, to be able to role model what allyship really means. Their followers will follow them. That's what leadership is about. And so you've got to role model it. And as much as big things will really turn the needle, don't underestimate the power of small things, small items. A word of encouragement here, a recognition of something that's going on in that individual's world, like when it was Diwali last week, just people without prompting saying to me Happy Diwali made it feel like a more inclusive world that we lived in. So remembering those small things matter. Of course, I want people to make huge strides and do big things as well, but don't feel like the small things aren't worth doing.
No, absolutely agree with that. And actually lots of small things add up to pretty big things in the end anyway. without those, it's those small things that are more that, well, they're easier to do. It doesn't need to be a project that we have to, kind of sit down and plan. How are we going to do this? It can just be something as simple as acknowledging a religious festival, for example, or asking about it. There was some fabulous stuff on social media during Diwali this year that I haven't been aware of before. I've kind of been aware of bits of it, and various different organisations and individuals will post I'll put a LinkedIn post, for example, with an image that says Happy Diwali, and there's the image of the candle, and you kind of, that's great. But actually this year there just seemed to be a lot more conversation going on around what it actually means,
you're
what
right.
it's about.
You're right. One of the things that we when I switched the TV on when I got back from my mum's, actually, we were out for Diwali. The Sky football match was on, and it was West Ham who was playing at home, and West Ham's ground is in East London, which has actually got quite a large multicultural community. And one of the things the Sky camera did was then pan to the skyline, and fireworks is a big thing for Diwali.
Yeah.
And it was this magical display of fireworks, and Sky used that as a way of acknowledging that it was Diwali, which is a brilliant example of just making multiculturalism a normal facet of life and celebrating it.
Yeah.
And really, I think if you think about the individual things I've said there, it's really about if you want to be an ally, you've got it in your hands to do that. It is about taking action. It can be small things, it can be big things. You don't need to be a senior individual. There's sometimes this aspiration of only people who in senior roles can do that. It is anyone and everyone can take that role, and in whatever shape you do that, big or small, be clear that it matters and it makes a difference, and it gives people hope that it will. But it takes courage.
Yes. Yeah. I think you made a really good point earlier. You made lots of really good points, but the one I'm referring to is around the fact that you don't need to be a senior person to do this. Anybody can be an ally. And also, if you're from a minority group yourself, that does not preclude you from being an ally
Indeed.
to someone in a different minority group. We've had a question in the chat earlier from Derek Hull about how comfortable are you with that? Is this something that comes naturally, Anit, or do you think about, right, okay, I want to go and find out more about this person, or what would be an example of that?
Good question. Well, look, I grew up in an era where the mantra was you've got to assimilate to be successful. And I carried that with me for a long time, that, what I needed to do was be like my white counterparts if I was going to succeed. And I hear similar from women where they say, if you want to be successful, before it was, you had to be like men.
Yeah.
And so actually the term allyship and my role as an ally isn't something that I thought about until relatively recently. I'd say within the last 3 to 5 years of my kind of working life. I'd always, I had recognised the role of allies in supporting me before, but I hadn't thought hard enough, more for me, rather embarrassingly, about my role as an ally to other groups of people. And if you then think about it logically, well, that just doesn't make much sense, because actually, whilst I might not appreciate the exact issues that those individuals go through, I can understand a bit more what it means about being in a minority group. So potentially, people from minority groups start this journey at a bit of an advantage. I'd go further than just saying I was embarrassed about it. Actually, I was being really selfish about it, because I was only thinking about myself in the terms of allyship, and I wasn't thinking about what I might do for others in that space. as well. So it was a moment of embarrassment to realise that I wasn't doing my part to be an ally for others.
It's interesting. And the other thing that I keep coming back to in my head, which is all around, how do we learn and how do we understand? The example that you shared with us at the beginning of this conversation around the situation at school with Diwali and Christmas in terms of why did you get an extra day off? What occurs to me there is that there's a phrase, isn't there, out of the mouths of babes.
Yeah.
When we are children, we don't have any of those restrictions on what we're going to say. And I'm sure any of us with children will have all been in an embarrassing situation or two
correct.
over the years where, your child says something that would not necessarily be what we would call socially correct. So that kind of almost where my head's going to is that if we could all put ourselves back into childhood mode in terms of instead of having these limits on us that say, well, that's not appropriate, that might be offensive. And I remember having a conversation with Sharon Amesu, who was one of our previous guests on the webinar, and saying to Sharon, I'm concerned that if I ask a question that it might be offensive, it might be the wrong question. And her response to me was, Nina, as long as you are asking with the right intent,
absolutely,
then that is fine.
Well, for me, that's all about this understanding point, right? If you think about that kind of those embarrassing situations when your kids have asked those difficult questions, and I remember a really difficult one when my kids were young, where I think we were in a restaurant or some other social environment, and clearly the person who was at the next table or near us hadn't used their deodorant that morning, and he said to me, "Dad, why does this man smell behind me?" in a loud enough voice where the guy could clearly have heard what he said. But in the way that my teacher did, which was just to very quickly and easily figure out how they could think of a parallel that brought that understanding to that individual, was very powerful. And one of the things allies can absolutely do is procure honest conversations. What is it? And it's possible that that people in the workplace today absolutely harbour some of those things, some of those issues. And if we don't have honest conversations, we can't get through those. So allies, I think, have a powerful role in helping breed those honest conversations in an environment of understanding and creating the right outcomes from those conversations, as opposed to letting those issues fester. Sometimes it can be quite obvious when there are smouldering issues, and you have to bring those to a head.
Absolutely. I think you definitely get my vote for let's have more honest conversations. I think let's be more curious and let's take action and do, rather than just say I'm an ally. So what actually is what are the actions? And we're going to come on to that obviously after the break, in terms of more practical ideas for people to take back to not just the workplace actually, but their whole life, in terms of how they can help in this area. Anit, thank you so much. From previous experience that I could talk to you for hours. I find your willingness to have these open and honest conversations and express your own vulnerability is really unusual, especially in the type of environment, the working environment that we're in. And I want to thank you for that again. You did it beautifully in the podcast that we did together, and you do it in every conversation we have. But thank you for sharing what you shared with us just now. And I'm looking forward to more input from you later on. But in the meantime, we're going to hand over to Gareth, and Gareth is going to talk to us about the magic that he's been working at First Bus. So for now, Anit, thank you so much. Gareth, welcome.
Hello, Nina. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome. I'm sure that you will have been absolutely enthralled with that conversation with Anit just then. I'm sure there'll be loads of things popping round your head in terms of your own thoughts and experiences. And I know from our previous conversations that allyship is such an important thing to you personally. I'm going to hand over to you to share with us what you will in terms of what you're doing, how you're approaching things at First Bus, having come from a completely different environment. You're now on the buses and making a difference very, very quickly. So enough from me. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Nina. And gosh, how do I follow? What a remarkable story from Anit there. And it's incredible. I've got so many notes that I just want to get into. So I'm going to resist that until I'm allowed to a little bit later on. And let's talk First Bus a little bit. But you asked me to start with a bit about me and I guess my story so far. And as you described at the introduction, I'm a dad, a husband, a son, a friend, a big Disney fan, a lover of the lawn, the lines you get in the lawn when you've just cut them. I'm a golfer and I'm the head of ED&I here at First Bus. But I've only been in this brilliant industry for around about 7 months. And my career so far has predominantly been in retail. I'm an operator at heart. I've ran little shops, big shops, square shops, round shops, lots of shops. As a regional manager, I've opened shops, I've closed shops, but always with a people lens. And then I was very fortunate enough around about 5 years ago to move into a more traditional people role within Asda, where I've spent the last 5 years moving around the people floor in areas like engagement and talent capability, L&D. And most recently into to diversity and inclusion. And I kind of described to you when we spoke, actually, I feel like a bit of an accidental ED&I expert. And, this isn't a job I ever applied for. And I remember that the moment that Jackie, my boss at Asda, came to me and said, Gareth, we really want to amplify our work in the ED&I space, and we'd like you to lead that for us. And I remember thinking they were talking about a different Gareth. I don't feel qualified to do this. And if one example of an ally is a supporter, actually. And Jackie, was a mentor, a sponsor, a supporter of mine. And I remember she said 3 things to me. She said, Gareth, you are curious, you're determined to make a difference, and you make stuff happen. And actually that is all the qualification you need to work in this space and drive the agenda, and that still resonates with me today. That I'm kind of a bit of an accidental ED&I expert, but absolutely love what I do and the opportunity that's afforded to me to make a difference in this space. And that's kind of what gets me up in the morning is that ability to make a difference. And so I find myself in First Bus. I joined the business back in March, and thoroughly having a great time. And what are we getting up to? Well, we've built a plan in First Bus that looks to accelerate our position as a truly inclusive business. And we've got a bit of a mission that we're going after. We've called it a journey to a place where everyone is welcome, can be their true selves and succeed. And we've specifically chosen those words, everyone welcome, true self, succeed, because, we recognize that this isn't just about one aspect of this cultural transformation. It's about diversity. It's about inclusion. It's about equity and equality, and it's about belonging. And so we've tried to capture that. Ultimately, and of course, the last webinar was creating, how do you create this sense of belonging? And that's kind of where the magic happens, right? That's where people start to be able to be their true selves, to not conceal their identities, to feel truly welcome and part of something, and a family, a belonging within an organization. And so to do that in Bus, we've embarked on a pretty ambitious and quite aggressive plan to really accelerate our way through to this place that I've just described. And it's strategically tactical, if you can have such a thing. We very deliberately looked to try and develop a plan that moves us quickly into a place where we can then start to consider the longer term. So this is a 12-month plan that we are going after. And my ability to drive this plan is ultimately with an executive in First Bus that are allies, that are behind the plan, and that take the action of allyship. And perhaps later we can have a look at the difference between passive and active allyship. Both are allies, but one takes up action. One is perhaps more of a bystanding community in the allyship space. And maybe we can unpack that a little bit later on. But, that permission, that ability is what's afforded to me. So we've got 5 pillars in our plan. The first is around building knowledge and confidence. The second about gaining momentum. The third is around enabling ED&I. We talk about data in the fourth, and then governance in the fifth. And if it'll be helpful, I'll give a few examples of kind of what we're up to in each of these pillars. So
that'd be great.
So the first then, build knowledge and confidence of our leaders. And this is specifically about the leadership teams in our business. We recognise that there is opportunity to help build knowledge and ultimately confidence in this space. I'm sure many of the folk on the call will recognise that it's often heard that there's a fear of saying the wrong thing, a fear of getting it wrong in this space. And therefore, actually, what we often see is people don't say anything at all. And if we've heard anything on the call already, it's about you need to show up. We're not going to progress if we don't say anything. So how do we encourage that development in this space? So a couple of things we're doing here. We've built a Celebrating Our Differences inclusion program. It's 8 45-minute bite-sized modules that we're delivering to our entire leadership team. And by leadership, what I mean is supervisor all the way up to executive boards. These are skills and narrative that needs to be understood and known by everybody in our leadership team. So far, we've delivered the first 2 modules. That is, why is D&I important, and banter, behaviours and bias. And actually, in why is D&I important, we talk about allyship. We talk about how to be an inclusion change agent through allyship. We address the active versus passive. And there's a really neat little model called the ACT UP model that, again, we might look at later. It's amplifier, curious, trusted, upstander and promoter. And this is about making allyship accessible. It doesn't have to be this big, hairy thing, and it's not a buzzword out there that sometimes people move away from. It's about what can you do to be an ally, and that ACTUP, ACT UP, is essentially 5 personas where you're likely to naturally fit into one of them, and therefore you can just bring your whole self to this and make a difference. So far, I'll say we've delivered 2 modules. We got to, in 18 sessions, 1,348 individuals. And you know what? It's quite remarkable and humbling that the comments that came from it, from it's the best thing since sliced bread to I really didn't want to come to this. I was really not looking forward to it. But actually, I was chatting to my family about it last night over dinner, and this is the impact it had, which I think is fantastic.
It's incredible. I was going to ask you, Gareth, whether to go through these modules is voluntary or everybody's going through these modules, but it sounds like everybody's going through them. Yeah.
So we've made it, purposely mandatory. And so far, 18 sessions, 70% of the population invited, from supervisor to exec board. And what I would say is all of the exec board have been on it, been on a session. Now, there's something quite nerving about delivering a session when your managing director is sat on the other end of the call. But, that's allyship, right? They're actively contributing and making a difference. So other things in Build Knowledge, we're building a program around reverse mentoring. I think this, and again, we've heard elements of this already from Anit, that it's incredibly important to try and see perspective from a different lens, different to your own. And I remember being reverse mentored by an individual in Asda, and it had the most profound impact on me. I truly couldn't understand. I thought I did, but the reality is I was nowhere near in my own lens and my own perspective, having even been close to considering the lens that individual has. We're calling it a day in my life. It launches in January, and I'm really looking forward to that. We're also bringing more external guests into the business. I think it's really important we give perspective. I think what I've seen so far is we can have a tendency to be quite insular, and it's a very traditional industry we're in here, and sometimes it's about the way we've always done it. So actually, sometimes an external perspective is really helpful, just to start to give a different perspective. So the second one, gain momentum, and this is more broader to the business. This is about raising awareness, ED&I, to all of our colleagues and connecting our colleagues together in this common conversation. This started as having a really clear position on ED&I in our business, and actually 2 weeks ago, Jeanette Bell, our managing director, wrote to every single colleague. Here's the letter that came through my postbox. Giving a very clear position on equality, diversity, inclusion, what it means to her and our business. And I think that's really important, being very clear from the top on what's okay and what's not. And also in that statement that went to every colleague's home address. And again, it was really important to us that we got to every colleague here. So we went with a slightly different tact than perhaps we traditionally have done so. On the other side of that letter, we launched our month of inclusion, and that is November. We're in it now. We're on day 3, and what we're doing across this month is sharing short videos, 60 to 90-second videos of colleagues from around our business that are sharing their lived experience or an ally to a community, and a top tip, a piece of advice on how you can be a better ally to that community. And we're sharing them internally, but also externally. These are messages. Whilst there may be a driver on a first bus with a first bus uniform, or an engineer in the workshop, or one of our team in the office space, actually the messages are universal. I'm incredibly proud of the campaign, and it features ultimately storytelling. I think storytelling humanizes ED&I. I think you get a raw reality, builds curiosity. You connect with a story in a way that you can't in any other way. So having it in this form, I think, is really important. And so far, we're only on day 3. We've had 3 videos so far. They're making a real impact.
The videos are brilliant, and I would encourage anybody. So you'll be inundated with LinkedIn requests, Gareth, but I would encourage anyone who is on the call today to connect with you on LinkedIn so that they can watch these videos, because they are superb. They are very, very good. And as you say, that storytelling, and coming back to something that Anit mentioned earlier, it's about, this is happening to real people. It's somebody, it's you can see it. You're not reading it in a book. It's not a newscaster telling us a story about something that's happened. It's a real individual telling us their story. And I agree. I think that's incredibly powerful.
Well, I mean, having lots of LinkedIn invites is a good problem to have, isn't it? So, please do watch the videos and share them. We're encouraging people. As I say, the messages here are universal. And I think this is something quite unique in the area that we work, that, let's not be precious about it's our work. We're in this together. We're trying to solve the same problem here, and in ultimately creating a more inclusive, sector, or indeed beyond that. So let's do this together. So they're out there. The colleagues, I'm so proud. I tell you what, Nina. We did a week of filming of these, and went from Aberdeen to Leeds to Swansea to Norwich to London, and it was the best week in my career. I met some incredible colleagues with just incredible stories behind them, that are willing to go on camera and share their story and consent to anybody watching it. Utterly remarkable. So if I carry on through, what else in this space? Well, we're also looking to do an intentional allyship program. How do we build a cohort of allyship, specific and intentional, to given underrepresented communities, to provide positive action towards that community and help them be the best they can be as they move through their career. Then there's enabling ED&I. It's not my favourite space, if I'm honest. It's policies, but it's really important. Having an infrastructure that underpins this cultural transformation is really, really important. So, we're building policies. We're building more inclusive policies with this golden thread through all of our position. We're working with a number of external consultancies like Timewise, where we're looking at flexible working. That we know, flexible working is the number one driver to gender equality. So we're getting behind that and looking what we can do, again, in a very traditional industry, dominated, significantly dominated by male. How do we look at gender equality with a different perspective to perhaps what we've done in the past?
That's really important as well. Sorry to interrupt you there, but from an employer value proposition, one of the things that we're noticing from our perspective as working in the recruitment side of the industry is that more and more people now, when we're talking to them about new opportunities, they want to know what the policies are. It's not about what we think we're going to do or what's being done on an informal basis. It's what are your policies around this area, because that tells a candidate a lot about your organisation and the culture of it, and actually whether they want to come and work with you or not. So it's really important on so many different levels.
It is, and actually that leads me on nicely, Nina, to data, because data is our Achilles heel, as it is in a lot of business. Of course, the data we hold is a bit patchy. It's not particularly credible. In many ways, we're asking the wrong questions, and therefore we're getting data that's not particularly useful. And quite frankly, we just don't have enough of it. We can't be confident the volume of our data represents truly our business and the communities within it. Yeah. So on the 18th of November, we launch our First Plus Census, a really simple exercise to invite colleagues to share more data with us, with the ultimate aim being able to drive meaningful action from it. And the reason why I kind of segued from what you said there is you've got to earn the right to ask colleagues for this data. You've got to earn the trust. You can't just whack a poster up on the wall and say, we need more data. If people don't trust us, they won't share it. If people don't understand the why, the narrative, the context of why we need this data, people won't share it. And so all that I've kind of described already, and a few more examples, is why it's been really important to accelerate and demonstrate what we're doing in ED&I, that this is really important to us. This isn't just something we're doing and we'll be on to something else next month. We're taking absolute tangible, making tangible difference to our business to improve our culture. And then the final pillar, if you like, of the five is governance, and this is about tracking progress. We've put in the last couple of months 6 networks into our business in order that we bring the voice of colleagues together, and each network is sponsored by an executive member. The primary role of the networks, colleague resource groups, call them what you like, is about listening, learning, and acting. Really, really straightforward. But actually, the premise here is that we want to listen to what's going on in our business on the ground. We want to learn from each other, and ultimately want to drive action. And of course, we've already said quite a few times on here that the action is a key attribute of being an ally. These are ultimately ally groups made up of folk with lived experiences within that network, or allies that want to support that network and make a difference in the way they can. But really importantly, sponsored by exec members around the table. And then once a quarter, those exec will come together in an inclusion forum chaired by our managing director, Jeanette, and ultimately looking at what's happened in the last quarter, where are we today, and what can we do as a team around the table to ultimately accelerate our way through the next quarter of activity.
Brilliant.
And 2 more points is, we've also introduced an inclusion index into our engagement survey, because I think a lot of businesses tend to focus on diversity, but don't necessarily give the same weight to inclusion. And it's a bit of a broken promise, right? So if you're back to my retail days, it's a bit like a shop window, but the goods on the shelves aren't what you promised in the window. So you've got to do both, in my view, in equal measures. So, whilst we can measure gender ratio, we can measure ethnicity. Actually, how do you measure inclusion as well, and make sure that in the business are also receiving the cultural transformation that we're aspiring to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you can have all the diversity targets in the world and you can achieve all of them, But if you are then bringing people into an organisation that doesn't feel inclusive, and it's kind of, well, you're here, we've ticked the box now, so we don't actually need to change anything else because we've got you in. Well, actually, no, you might have got me in, but I'm not going to hang around if you can't demonstrate that I'm welcome here and that I belong here. So I'm completely with you. Inclusion is where it's at.
Absolutely. And ultimately, of course, that leads to belonging, which is kind of where the magic happens. And it's really important you have both in equal measures. If you join a business and you don't have a voice, you can't see yourself in the business, you aren't represented, then you see it in the turnover figures, right? The attrition in the first 6 months is really, really high. And then finally, and this I guess is ultimately what we're doing today, we've launched within First Group, of course, we've got the bus side, but then the TOCs as well.
Yeah.
And we've come together and we're talking together about what we're doing, what's working, what isn't working. And I think that's a really healthy conversation. So we can ultimately all learn from each other, and that's what this is all about. And that's been really successful in bringing this collective voice together and learning from each other.
Yeah.
So that's our plan. Ultimately driving to this place, a place where everyone is welcome, can be their true selves and succeed at First Bus. And so far is landing really well. And I go back to where I started, I think, which is having a senior leadership team that are receptive to the plan, that is putting their weight behind it, that is creating positive, active allyship and intentionally making change and difference is paying dividends.
Yeah. Gareth, thank you so much. I mean, I'm amazed at the amount of stuff that you've done since you landed 7 months ago. But also that you've managed to sum it up so beautifully in that 20-minute slot that I'd given you as well. So congratulations for that. You've given us some massively valuable information there, and I know that more's going to come out in the next session. So we are going to take a short break. We're going to have a comfort break so that people can stretch their legs, do whatever you need to do. Be back here again, ideally at 15:40, so 20 to 4 if you can, but that only gives you 6 minutes. So if you need a little bit longer, let's go for 10. Let's go for 10 minutes. We'll go for 3:45. So there you go, that's 11 minutes. Back here, we're going to go into a discussion around how to the strong ally debate. So bringing in some more of what Gareth's doing at First Bus, talking about the ACT Up, because I think that's a brilliant one that we can focus on, and some other ideas that we have collectively as a group that we're seeing. So let's kind of get that conversation going. I am very aware that there are some brilliant questions in the chat, some amazing questions. So those are all being collated. And so don't worry, if you've asked a question and we've not come to it, Q&A session is to follow. So make sure that you stay tuned in. Have a comfort break now. See you back here at 3:45. Thank you so much, Anit. Thank you, Gareth.
Hello.
Hiya.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Thank you so much for that first half. It was amazing. So much, and obviously so striking a chord with so many people in the chat as well, and lots of love for both of you from our audience in terms of what you've shared so far. So thank you both for that. So we will crack on. So welcome back to everybody who is still with us for this second half of our Allyship in Transport webinar. I'm sure that you will agree, and I know you do because I've read some of the chat comments as we've been going through, that the first half of this webinar has been really powerful. So we're going to go on now to looking at some of the questions that have come in, and there are some cracking questions. So I'll make sure that we've got plenty of time to deal with those. As we've gone through, we've had quite a lot of information in the conversation around what makes a good ally. And I kind of want to come back, if we can start by asking Gareth to just give us a bit more context in terms of this. What's a passive ally and what's an active one? And we have had a comment in the chat as well around this. It's kind of Flora has asked us, how do we overcome those performative allies in life and the workplace, the ones that can do a good talk without walking the walk? So what do we do there?
Cool. Yeah. So you gave a definition, Nina, at the beginning around support. It's someone who wants to support, and I think I'd probably also add in somebody that chooses to support as well. I think this is a choice as to whether you be an ally or not, and to perhaps somebody that's marginalised or underrepresented group. And for me, as I said, there are two types in my eyes. I think there's, if you had to put them into two buckets, I guess, there's active and there's passive. An active ally is somebody that stands up for marginalised groups. It's somebody, if they'll talk the talk, but when the doors are shut, nobody's watching, they'll take action still. They'll stand by what they said they will do.
Yeah.
Whereas a passive ally is perhaps more of a bystander in this space. Perhaps they're more sympathetic. So they'll say the right sort of stuff, but when the doors are shut and nobody's watching, maybe they'll do something different. They probably won't stand by what they said. Now, I think importantly, by definition, both are allies, of course. You know, both will acknowledge and respect different perspectives. They'll do their best to avoid assumptions and stereotyping. They'll probably educate themselves in experiences of others, and they'll probably learn about their own biases and privileges. So both are allies and will probably do that. The difference here for me is about taking action, and an active ally takes action, whereas a passive ally perhaps doesn't do what they say they were going to do.
Perfect. I think I've been doing such a lot of reading on this subject, and this term performative allyship keeps coming up time and time again, where we will, wear a lapel pin, or, change something on our LinkedIn profile, or, say that we've read a book. I am currently reading a book, which, and I think it was Dawn that's asked about resources to support being a good ally. I'm reading this at the moment, The Good Ally by Nova Reid. It's a docking big book. So it's not one to take to bed because I can't hold it up because it's too heavy. It's a really good book, but I would have to tell you it's very uncomfortable to read because we are starting off in this particular book is very focused on race, and it's starting off from the premise that the reader is racist, and then it kind of takes that apart and puts it back together again. She shares some examples where during the Black Lives Matter, the significant kind of focus on that after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, that people were sharing things on their LinkedIn profiles, on their posts about Nova's work. She does anti-racist workshops and seminars and so on, training in that area. They were saying that they'd signed up for the events, that they were going to the events, that they'd read the book, that they'd done this, that and the other. And actually, they hadn't done any of that, but they were just talking a good game of doing it. So I think that is a challenge that we've got. But is there a positive spin on that or not? Anit, do you have a? I'm going to pass that one to you if I can. Is an ally a positive thing? Full stop. But as Gareth has explained to us before, an active one is possibly more what is what we're looking for more than a passive one. Yeah.
Well, look, I'd rather have a passive ally than somebody who wasn't. I think we do need to recognise that being an active ally takes courage and it takes commitment and conviction. And some of that, it can be as difficult for an ally to be like that in the wrong environment as it is to be to feel some of that difficulty. So I don't harbour resentment towards passive allies. And my hope is also that can be a staging journey. Your realisation from this matters to I'm going to do something about it. And I say that with respect to my own journey on my allyship of others that I hadn't seen before. And it would be entirely hypocritical of me to not recognise that. So the question that we might ask ourselves as organisations or so on is how do we make it easier for people to be active? Much of what I saw Gareth as talking about is creating an environment where allies can go from being passive to being active. And when we talk about safe space, quite a lot of questions, comments about safe space earlier on. Maybe there's such a concept of you need a safe space to be an ally as well, which is what Gareth is doing so brilliantly in the work he's doing.
Yeah, thank you, Anit. So I'm going to pass that back to you, Gareth. Then, in terms of best practice around this area, how do we provide that safe space? How do we encourage people? And is it a leadership responsibility? Is it something that comes from the top? And as you've shared with us, you've got your intentional allyship as part of the work that you're doing at First Bus.
Yeah, and I'd echo Anit's answer there as well. Actually, I think clearly what we want are active allies, not passive. But an ally is an ally, and perhaps if people are able to show up in the best way they can, then actually allyship is allyship, right?
Yeah.
It will ultimately make a difference. We're talking about scale, I guess, of difference here in the role, and I think it's also really important for me that we make it accessible. I think sometimes when you hear some language around this, like allyship, it feels like this big hairy thing that's almost impenetrable. It's one of them HR buzzwords that you maybe can't get to. So I think one of our roles is how we can show people really simple stuff they can do that can start to make a difference. And it doesn't need to be big stuff. It could be as much, just learning about a given community will start to alter your behaviour towards that community. It just will. So if that's reading an article about Black Lives Matter on the BBC News app, or it's reading a book, or it's just having a chat at the pub and saying, oh, that felt a bit uncomfortable, what do you think about it? Then actually you're starting to create this momentum. But I also think we need to be quite kind to ourselves as well, Nina. We're never going to get everybody to be an ally. That's just reality. We in the sessions I talk about this kind of bus analogy that we're going to have a third of a business perhaps at the front of the bus, sat at the bus, driving the bus forward, driving the ED&I agenda, got the will and the skill maybe. In the middle, perhaps we've got the passengers that are sat in the middle that have got the will but just don't know how. They're not sure on how to do this, and we can help with that. Fantastic. They're listening, they're hearing us, and maybe just maybe there's folk at the back of the bus that are skeptics in the D&I space, don't know why we're doing this, don't buy into it. And the reality is we're never going to convert everybody. So I think we've got to be mindful of where we put our energy, and for me that's in the middle passengers. It's the folk in the middle that we can invite to take a step, stand up, take a step forward, sit down in the seat in front of you, and create this momentum, this surge in allyship. If you want to use a transport analogy, there you go.
I think that's a brilliant analogy, actually.
I think, for me, this is about, as I said, it's about small steps that we can offer up to folk to say, consider this. What about your pronouns? Use your pronouns in your email signature, and better still, put a link in there while you're doing that. So when people see it, they're going to see them, and also there's an informative piece to educate people going forward. Yeah. What's your language you're using? Be careful of your intent versus the impact, and just these small things that can lead towards. But I do think we've got to be kind to ourselves here, and also I think we need to bring people with us. And we can't go striding ahead too quickly and leave too many on the bus that are just don't really know what's going on. No,
perfect analogy. I love it. Anit, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, and Gareth, a couple of things you said there really triggered a thought in my mind about to solve a problem first, you've got to recognise the problem exists, and if the journey there that the folk on Gareth's bus was talking about is on that journey of recognizing a problem exists, which creates awareness that then creates a willingness to do something about it. Then all the better, because there is no doubt in my mind that there are people in our industry who don't believe we have a problem in this industry. People have said that to me in direct challenge to some of the times that I talk about this issue. They have directly challenged me and said, we don't really have an issue in this industry around equality, diversity, or inclusion. If you genuinely don't believe we've got a problem, we could have a long debate, and that's probably another subject of one of these.
Yeah.
Then you're never going to be an ally. But if you're moving through that curve, then that's another person that can help us get there, because they have to get into even passive allyship. You've got to recognise and accept there's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely, and I definitely agree with you. I think that the denial that there is a problem is very much alive and kicking in many organisations, and we see that from an employer value proposition when we're talking to clients about attracting talent into their organisations. There is definitely a huge amount of work to do, and we've that kind of going at the pace we need to go at. We've had a comment in there from Shireen around, no, we can't go slow, we've got to go fast because we're losing good people. So how do we accept that we've got to go? Oh, I don't know. Do we go at the pace of the slowest person, Gareth, or what? How do we do that? How do we make sure that we're gaining some momentum and we're going quickly enough before it's too late and all the good people have gone?
I think it's a really great position to ask, actually. Do we go the slowest one? No, we don't. I think we need to go at a pace that we can maintain and bring people with us. I think for me that's the litmus test. Are we seeing month on month improvement in anecdotally in conversation or in the numbers? What's the data telling us? But we've got to take people with us on this journey, and I think we need, with that, tangible, demonstrable evidence that we are making steps that are improving our business, and that we're not just talking about it, because there's a lot of folk, there's a lot of businesses that just kind of talk about this stuff and don't actually make difference. And they can be small things, so TNTs, tiny noticeable things. I was introduced to this by Hayley, the CPO in Asda, and she talked about TNTs, tiny noticeable things. And I love the idea. And what small steps can you take? We used to charge £10 to change your name on your staff card. And I was chatting to somebody one day that was transitioning and was horrified that they were having to pay to change their name because they're transitioning. And I couldn't agree more. And so we addressed it. Within 24 hours, we changed the policy, and now name changes are completely free of charge. And it's little examples that we can hold up and say, we're listening, we're working hard on this, and we're prepared to change. If you keep walking towards us with this and sharing, your voice, and I think it's little things like that actually have quite a big shift in people being able to buy in to this cultural transformation that we're on. Yeah, it's back to those small things again, isn't it, that we mentioned earlier? It's that, it doesn't have to be a great big thing, but actually changing something that's a process that's been in place. And actually, probably nobody can even remember why it was there, but it's the way we've always done it. So we'll carry on doing it. Well, actually, no, let's look at this afresh. Let's look at this from a different perspective. If I may, Nina, just to also pick up on what Anit said around, do we have a problem, yes or no? I think we need to be really careful about the questions we ask as well. If we ask a business like ours, made up predominantly of white males, do you feel included in this business? The reality is we're going to get quite a significant score of folks saying, yeah, I do. Yeah. So we've just got to be careful that, are we asking the right questions that inform the direction of travel, or are we asking questions that are giving us a positive answer, but it's actually a bit of a false positive if we look at it in the wider context.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to move on to questions because we've got some crackers. So I want to make sure we've got enough time for you both to respond to these fantastic questions that the audience have given us. But quickly before we do that, because I don't want to miss the opportunity to come back to your act up, Gareth, because I know that people will be saying, yeah, but what was that? So can you give us a quick explanation of that before we move into the questions, please?
Yeah, right. Let me do this in a minute then. So hold on tight, folks. So act up, ACTUP, a model, if you like, from for active allyship. It's adapted from this book here. I am not affiliated with this book in any way. It's Better Allies by Karen Caitlin. It's a really nice book. It's slightly not as big as yours. So it's more
my kind of book, actually. Yeah.
So what this is 5 personas that you can broadly fit within, and what I kind of talk about here is that the chances are you probably naturally fit into one of these personas. So the point being, by being you can be an ally, and are you an amplifier? Now, an amplifier is about ensuring that a wide range of voices are heard. It's about bringing that quietest voice to the table and amplifying that voice out. That is a way of being an active ally. Are you curious? A curious learner puts their own opinions and frame of reference perhaps to one side to challenge and learns about the challenges and prejudices faced by colleagues. So, just learning, this kind of point I said earlier, just learning about a given community or a topic or an aspect of ED&I is enough to slightly change your behaviour to it. And that is a way of being an ally. Are you a trusted advisor? This is about somebody who will use their role, their experience, their position to mentor perhaps or sponsor an individual or a group, often show up as mentors or sponsors. It's about using your experience to help those that perhaps have not been fortunate enough to have those experiences afforded to them. Are you an upstander? An upstander will shut down and report. And Anna, you said something earlier, prepared to challenge. For me, upstanders are the allies that are prepared to challenge. They know the difference between right and wrong. And if a wrong is done, they will address it and make sure that they call it in or call it out so that it can be addressed and the behaviour change going forward. And finally, are you a P for promoter? And this is about inviting folk to the table and making sure that they are promoted for the potential that they have within them. So similar to trusted advisor in many ways, it's about using your role, your position in a business to potentially bring them forward and make sure they get to be the best they can be and present themselves and be promoted at the table. So it's an act up, and it's just something that really struck a chord with me, Nina. And it's back to the premise here is you can probably naturally fit within one of those 5 personas quite naturally. I think you've got points of all of them or a few of them, but choose to be an active ally and make a difference. Yeah, brilliant. I love that, and I think what it does for me is say for people who kind of say, well, I'd love to do this, but I don't know where to start. I think looking at that act up and say, right, well, where do I fit within there? And if I know that is more like me in terms of my behaviour and my personality, then that helps me understand what actions I can choose to take. And let's do small steps at the beginning and let's gain the momentum. Absolutely. Thank you for covering that for us. Brilliant. We have got loads of questions and some really pertinent questions. We've covered some as we've gone through, and some of them I think are kind of similar questions. So I'll try and cover much of it as I can before we bring the webinar to a close at 4:30. I'm going to start with one from Sandy Sohal. What is the point at which we stop asking people to share their trauma in organisations which are not yet anywhere near as safe as they should be? So coming back to the safe space question, what is actually happening on a practical level to have the majority groups do their own work? So how do we make it safe for people to share their story within an organisation is my interpretation of what Sandy's asking here.
Nina, I think the question goes further. I think the questions aren't actually saying we're doing quite a lot to understand those. We're putting people through some significant difficulties in doing that. It's quite difficult talking about those.
Yeah.
I think what we're being asked is not just how do we create a safe space, but actually the truth is there. We now know what it is, what the lived experiences are of people in minority groups across all of the characteristics. So the continual asking of that question is no longer the relevant thing to do.
Right.
We've asked that question now. We know the answers to those questions. The only reason to ask that question now should be the things we've done to change those lived experiences. Has it had the impact it should have? It's a really thought-provoking question because it's not something I had thought of before that question. And I think there's a couple of answers to that question. My own personal view, from my own personal position, is I'm not going to stop talking about the trauma, because as soon as I do, I'm not being authentic to who I am and my real life experiences that I've had. And we heard about the powerfulness of storytelling before. So I think, therefore, I can then see the leap that you've made to continue to make that a safe space for people to have a conversation. And often a way to do that is creating things like staff networks that allow people to have those conversations in safe environments, to anonymize those conversations beyond there, to continue to do it. I decided a long time ago that if I was going to bring change about here, then I was going to have to make myself vulnerable and put myself out there to say those things. But I think that's potentially different for a leader than it might be for non-leaders, because I can create that self space for myself, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So my honest answer to that question is, as long as we've got an issue, we need people facing those issues to have a voice. And creating that safe space for those voices is the middle ground to that space, because otherwise those people who believe we don't have a problem may believe we've solved that problem when those voices stop.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got confirmation in the chat from Sandy that is what she was asking. So well done for interpreting that better than I did. Gareth, have you got anything that you want to add into that question?
Only to say, I think that I don't think we'll ever stop asking and listening to lived experiences. I think there will always be a need for us to continue to learn and understand each other better. And so I don't foresee a time when we will stop. And I think we should always create the space to be able to use stories to learn from and be a better ally. So I think it's an incredibly powerful question, Sandy, and I think you've built it beautifully there too. I don't foresee a time when we'll ever stop. But we're always going to learn from each other. That's the human race.
Yeah,
I think what we can think about is the return that we give people for that. So there's, provided we do it in a way to learn and then take action, then people will. So there's the safe space element. There's also got to be an improvement in the lived experiences of those people for it to be worth the while.
Exactly. And there's a question from Jen Clare that came in quite early doors, really, but it ties into what we've just been talking about. So Jen says it's a fine balance between being inquisitive and making the effort to explore other people's world, culture, life, etc. Are there any tips on how people can explore it without innocently causing offence?
Go on, Anit.
Yeah, look, the way in which you ask the question is all. So again, from my personal experience, if you do it from genuine interest and curiosity, it comes through in the way you ask the question. Better to ask the question and be careful about how you ask it than stop yourself from asking the question.
Yeah.
More often than not, you will find that people are proud of their culture and they want to talk about it if you do it in the right way.
Yeah.
It can be, think about when you ask the question, if somebody's going through a difficult time, they might pursue that presume you're asking that because you're making some kind of linkage. But do it in a thoughtful way, trusting your ability to ask those questions thoughtfully. And if you're coming at it from a good heart, it will probably shine through.
It's going to land, isn't it? Brilliant. Yeah. Gareth, what's your perspective on that one?
Yeah, I'll give an example. I think the pronunciation of somebody's name, and the microaggression that exists quite significantly in society is that if I don't know how to pronounce it, or I can't do it easily, I'll create a new name for the individual because it's easier for me. And actually, that's just not okay. Cuts right to the core of an identity. But actually, the solution, of course, is just ask. But I think with humility, and in my role, I meet lots and lots of people where I'm not clear how to perhaps pronounce their name correctly, and therefore I just ask, and it's a great conversation starter. And I want to make sure I get your name right. Could you help me just pronounce it properly? And actually, what I've never yet had anybody give me a hard time for asking that question. In fact, what you see is a degree of appreciation that I'm making an effort. And so I think that for me, Nina, is a bit of an example around if you ask, like Anit said, if you ask the right way from a place of curiosity and actually from a place of positive intent of trying to get this right or learning or understanding, then I think everybody is prepared to share their story around that. Yeah,
and it's part of the learning. So if we're going to learn and then be able to take some informed action, then that has got to it's got to come from somewhere. And the questions, even though they might feel uncomfortable to start with, as you've said, if they're coming from a good heart and with the right intent, then that's how we're going to move forward. David Sylvie would like to know, Gareth, how easy was it to get people to record their lived experiences on camera?
Actually, you know what? Remarkably easy, David. And this kind of goes back to the point here that I think they feel represented. They have a voice and they want to help and share. I was expecting it to be a bit more tricky than it was, but ultimately I ended up having to find different routes to recognise other folk because I only had 1 month to do this. We were inundated, and some quite remarkable stories. The vulnerability, the bravery, the courage that some of our colleagues have committed to camera are quite remarkable. And I utterly applaud them. Now, we are rewarding them for doing this. And Anit, to your point earlier, that there has to be a reward to this. And I think there's two sides to reward. I think there's recognizing them for what they're doing and attaching a so what to it as well. And it's got to drive change. This isn't just a campaign that at the end of November, those closely involved pat themselves on the back and crack on. We're measuring the success of this program. Of this campaign, and if it doesn't drive a difference, then then we need to unpick it, and understand. So what worked, what didn't, where can we learn to unlearn, relearn, go again, and do something different that will drive it. But David, remarkably straightforward, and for that I'm hugely grateful of the colleagues that have come forward.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because people have been so prepared to do it. It's kind of how long have they been waiting to be asked to share their lived experiences? And now that they have, that knowledge that you've built a trust and the exec team have built an environment of trust, that people know that it was fine to be vulnerable, to share those lived experiences, because actually it's for the greater good. But we're not just going to let it at the end of November, oh, well, that's great because we've done that campaign, let's move on to the next one. It will be part of creating a legacy within First Group for a better working environment for those who come after. So amazing, and well done to everybody who appeared on the videos as well. Anit, there's one for you here from Fazana Hakim. I'm interested to see why Anit thinks there are so few senior leaders from a minority background in the industry, but so many staff at lower levels. is it enough to say that we're going to try and recruit more diverse candidates, or is there more room for mentoring and identifying potential leaders and nurturing them?
Yeah, it's a very uncomfortable question, because there is an absolute truth that is implied in that question, which is inescapable. So a couple of years ago, NRL did something called the Race Matters survey, which talked about what was the lived experiences of ethnic minorities in this case, very specifically around that group. What we found was ethnic minorities applied for more internal jobs proportionately, but they were less successful in achieving appointment in those roles.
Yeah.
And there was a built-in bias in the processes and the ways that the resourcing managers worked and the recruiters worked that meant that they were less successful. It's uncomfortable truth, because what it means is that there is definitely a cause there that is uncomfortable, that unconscious bias, or in some instances conscious bias, meant that that there wasn't senior representation. So that really brings in the concept of equity, which means that you need to therefore work harder to with those communities and the processes. And what you described there in the question is exactly some of the activities that have happened in Network Rail, where extra effort is now going in to help prepare those candidates to be better prepared for those roles. The process has been worked through to understand where are the biases in the system that create those. It's a really good example of, if anyone says we haven't got a problem, the data tells us we have.
Yeah.
And then you have to work hard at it. And the first round of those extra efforts, so for example, talent groups that were deliberately set for trying to reverse that bias, has resulted in people beginning to do that. Now, let's be clear though that this is about, the I in ED&I stands for inclusiveness. So it isn't about trying to therefore marginalise another group of people whilst giving this group of people extra. The horrible word of positive discrimination. How two words like that can go together is just impossible in my mind. And if teams, we haven't got long enough to go through in detail some of those programs that were put in place, but there are people on this call who I've seen, names that I've seen, who we can put together to understand what work we did there. But the honest answer to your question is an uncomfortable one, which is the reason for that is because opportunities are not as common for some of those ethnic minorities as for minorities, and it's true of other minority groups as well.
Yeah. But we are seeing something start to change.
Yes, of course,
more support happening.
I think that's right, and also my own experience in the transition team means that we can have a different outcome if we choose to.
Yeah.
So in my transition team, we're about 150 people so far. We have 44% women, 25% ethnic minorities, 8% of people with stated disabilities, and we've only been able to recruit from the rail industry.
Yeah.
So in an industry that isn't that well represented, we've been able to do something different there. So it is possible, but it's not just going to happen.
Yeah, and I think those statistics are brilliant. You shared those with me the other week when we caught up, and they're all above the industry average. And the point you make is really pertinent. You have only recruited from the rail industry, so in an industry which is not diverse, you've managed to create an organisation which is getting towards where we want it to be. Are you able to share with us, Anit, because I think people will want to. It's like, well, how have you done that then? Because that looks like a really difficult task, and I'm sure it's not a simple answer. But is there anything you can share with us in terms of how you've achieved that?
Well, look, the first thing to say is when you're setting up something new, it's so much easier to start from the right place than adjust it. So, it's we have that advantage. Beyond that, though, we set out deliberately as one of our defining characteristics that we wanted in GBRTT was to be the example that we wanted to set for the rest of the industry. For those of you who are aware of the Williams Review, that was one of the things that Keith Williams found, was that the industry was not diverse. Now, I want to be clear: is we have that set of stats is one of the aspects of ED&I. It just shows data-based diversity. We've still got to work on inclusivity. We've still got to work on equality, and those are not achieved automatically by diversity. We need to do that. But setting out that really clear frame of we wanted to do that. Secondly, when we created the leadership team, we did have a mixed leadership team, and I think that also creates the right outcome. People see that journey. Then as we went about the recruitment, our resourcing team were determined to set in place a process that gave us the best possible chance and called people out when their recruitment started not looking like it was achieving those things. And it made people stand back and think, have I just done that as fairly as I could have? And then it began to spread. People began to talk about it. And one of my proudest moments was when somebody who had, so I for all new starters, and we're small enough I can do this, I have a session, or we offer a session to all new starters 2 or 3 months into their journey with us, to have a kind of a group discussion with 6 or 7 of us, including me. And one of my proudest moments was when somebody who had been in the industry for almost all their working life was able to say this was the first place that they felt like they could be themselves. And this was an individual who had a visible disability, who was from the LGBT community. It's the first time they were able to say to the colleagues around them that they came from the LGBT plus community. And that, for me, then gets us into the space of this person is able to feel comfortable and come to work as themselves and be what they can be in the best way they can.
Yeah. That's a brilliant example. And, in terms of, as you say, the stats are one story, the inclusivity and the equality is another story. But that's a brilliant example that something is going right. And that's really, really good to hear. That makes my heart very happy.
Equally, I do, though, want to emphasise we still also have a long way to go. So I haven't cracked it, and we've still got a lot more to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul McGonigal-White has asked a question around how do you make people feel comfortable to open up? I find it hard to get individuals to want to share their story, and I find that people enjoy watching and reading these experiences but don't necessarily want to be involved and be so vulnerable. Any tips from either of you in relation to creating an environment where people do want to share their experiences?
Maybe I'm at a bit of an advantage here, because I find being honest about my experiences is a great opener for other people's stories.
Yes.
But actually, if you think about it, all of you have some vulnerability to put out there. And putting out that vulnerability can be a great opener for somebody else to feel safe.
Yeah.
Because if you've had the courage to be vulnerable to somebody, you are showing you are safe in their company.
Yeah.
They may be safe. They may be encouraged to feel safe in your company.
Yeah, brilliant answer. And I completely agree. Absolutely. Gareth, what's your experience on helping to create that environment, which clearly you've done with all these colleagues agreeing to appear on video?
I'd echo what Anit says. I think it's about showing a humility, a vulnerability. I think if I've quite recently watched Brené Brown's Power of Vulnerability, the 18 minutes of TED Talk, brilliance.
Amazing.
But I watched it with a slightly different lens, Nina. I watched it with how can I use what Brené is talking about to create an environment. So instead of the power of vulnerability for me, how can I use what Brené is talking to create the strength, the power if we have an organisation, a story, a narrative on vulnerability. And I think it brings a really different perspective to the kind of conversation. I think you've got to have proof points. You've got to show people we're serious. You've got to have some so what attached to it. You've got to have a leadership team that is consistently behind the narrative. I think all of that comes into the kind of the core of a psychologically safe organisation.
Yeah.
But I also think having authenticity is really important. When I spoke to the colleagues that the superstars of our month of inclusion, I came from a place of being an ally. Right back round to what this is about. That I want to make a difference here, and I know I need your help to do that. And actually, I think they appreciate that. They understand it, and we can see we can do this together. The principles of collaboration in live and kicking here. So I think, but there's no one way, and that's the important thing I think here. You can't just do one thing and all of a sudden it's going to work. This is a very complicated cultural transformation, and ED&I is I think for me an enabler of engaged colleagues. It's one of the pillars of engagement that lead to this organizational culture. So sadly there isn't an easy way. If it was as straightforward as you need to be more inclusive, then we wouldn't be having this webinar and I wouldn't have a job. This is a very complicated cultural piece, but it's starting to turn and make a difference.
Yeah. Thank you. We've got so many brilliant questions. We are at 2 minutes before we need to finish the webinar. So unfortunately, we won't have time for any more of them. We have captured them all. And if we can, if when I go through the transcript from the chat and pick out some of the questions, if I feel like we can answer those in more fully for you, then I absolutely will put that out onto a LinkedIn post or as part of the material that supports the recording of this webinar. I think in summary, some of the things that have come out of today's discussion for me, and there is so much wisdom and experience and knowledge that's been shared. So massive thanks to both of you, but also to the audience for asking some great questions. But I think what the things I'm pulling out from it is that it's important to embed the data. Because you need to know what your processes are and how you can make sure that your processes are aligned with your diversity and inclusion and equality goals and objectives for your business to support your decision making and for measuring how far you've come along that journey. I think we can all agree that we need to perhaps collectively be better at calling out inappropriate behaviour. So if we see it, we should be calling it out. I think embedding inclusion in your company values and your language, it's not just about the diversity statistics, it's around making people feel that they belong within your organisation. Another one that came out for me when I was doing some reading prior to today was to believe people's experiences. When somebody shares a story, not to be incredulous and not to kind of have this air of disbelief, but just to listen and learn and take action as appropriate afterwards. So I think that kind of moving from awareness, and hopefully we've kind of nudged the dial today with that, to education, to learning more about how we can be better allies and how we can provide strong allyship within our lives and not just within the workplace, and then take that forward into action. What are we going to choose to do? And I think that, to your point, Gareth, that you've made several times, and it's a really good one, it's to choose to be an ally, it's to choose to make a difference, because quite honestly it's the right thing to do. And don't stop because it's harder, it's uncomfortable, just keep going. Thank you so much to Anit and to Gareth. You've just been fantastic, both of you. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you giving up your time to join us and to kind of support what we're doing our best to do at Intuitive and kind of add some value to our community by having these opportunities to talk about a subject which quite honestly, is critical to the future of the transport industry, as far as I'm concerned, in relation to whether we hold on to talented people and whether we continue to attract them in the future. As I've said, the sessions will be available on the website. So if you want to watch again, or if you want to direct your colleagues who may be interested in what we've talked about today, then you'll be getting a link. Everyone who registered for the webinar today will get a link to those recordings. We would, of course, like you to share your views and comments and thoughts on social media. Tag us in and let us know what you got out of today, what you're going to do differently, what you've learnt. And we'd love to know your feedback. I know quite a few of you have done that already. Thank you to Caroline for being a superstar in the chat room. If ever there was a perfect place for our Caroline to be, it's in the chat room. So thank you to Caroline for that. And thank you to Toby and the team at Workshop, because as always, they've been brilliant at keeping me straight on the technology side of things. Thank you all so much indeed for joining us. Please join us next time. We'll be doing more of these in 2023. And for now, have a lovely evening and take care.